You ruin everything just by showing up, my granddaughter whispered at Sunday service as she placed her hand lightly on my elbow and guided me away from the front pew where my family had sat for generations. I looked at her face, searching for a trace of the little girl who used to run into my arms after children's choir practice, but all I saw was impatience wrapped in a polished smile. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. I simply adjusted the strap of my handbag, smoothed the navy blue skirt I had pressed the night before, and walked toward the back of the sanctuary while members of our congregation pretended not to notice. My name is Margaret Whitaker. I'm 72 years old, a widow, and until that morning, I believed that if you loved your family enough, eventually that love would find its way back to you. The sanctuary of First Community Church in Franklin, Tennessee, looked as beautiful as it always had. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting pools of red and gold across the polished wooden floors. The scent of fresh lilies from the altar arrangements mixed with the familiar smell of old hymnals and furniture polish. The choir was rehearsing softly, voices rising and falling beneath the vaulted ceiling. It should have comforted me. This church had witnessed nearly every chapter of my adult life. I had stood at this altar in a white dress and promised to love Robert Whitaker until death parted us. I had carried both my children through those front doors wrapped in christening blankets. I had organized bake sales, folded bulletins, prepared casseroles for grieving families, and taught Sunday school for almost 20 years. When the fellowship hall roof leaked after a storm decades ago, Robert and I wrote one of the first donation checks to help repair it. We never talked about those things because that's what you do for the people you love. You simply show up. That morning, I arrived 20 minutes early, just as I always had. I pinned the pearl brooch Robert gave me on our 40th anniversary to my blouse and drove the familiar 12-minute route from my small white house to church. I had been looking forward to this service because my granddaughter Ashley was being recognized for her work with the youth outreach ministry. I was proud of her, proud enough to overlook the unanswered phone calls that had become more frequent over the years, proud enough to ignore the invitations that somehow reached everyone except me, proud enough to tell myself that busy young people often forgot things they didn't mean to forget. I spotted my son Daniel near the front pew beside his wife, Heather. Ashley stood nearby in a pale pink dress, laughing with friends. For a moment, I smiled. Families go through difficult seasons, I reminded myself. There was still time for healing. I started toward them, Bible tucked beneath my arm. Ashley's smile vanished the instant she noticed me approaching. She crossed the aisle before I reached the pew. Her voice remained sweet enough that anyone passing by would think she was offering assistance. "Grandma," she said quietly, "it would really be better if you sat in the back today." I blinked in confusion. Why would I do that, sweetheart? Her jaw tightened for the briefest moment before she leaned closer and delivered the sentence that settled into my chest like winter frost. "Because you ruin everything with your presence." Behind her, Daniel lowered his eyes. Heather busied herself rearranging the service program in her lap. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them told her to stop. I felt something shift inside me then. Not anger. Not even heartbreak. Just a quiet understanding that perhaps this moment hadn't appeared out of nowhere. Perhaps people don't suddenly decide you're unwelcome. Perhaps they've been finding smaller ways to move you farther and farther back until one day they finally ask you to disappear altogether. I nodded once. "Of course," I said softly. Then I turned and walked toward the last pew in the sanctuary, carrying my Bible in both hands, wondering how long my family had been hoping I would stop showing up. From the back pew, the sanctuary looked different. The stained glass windows still glowed with soft morning light, and the choir still sang the same hymns I had known by heart for decades. But distance has a way of changing things. People who once felt close suddenly appeared like strangers moving through a carefully rehearsed performance. I rested my hands on the worn leather cover of my Bible and listened as the congregation rose together to sing. My voice joined theirs quietly, even though my throat felt tight. I knew every note of "Great is thy faithfulness." Robert used to squeeze my hand during the chorus because he always sang off-key and claimed the Lord appreciated enthusiasm more than talent. The memory came so clearly that for a moment I could almost hear his gentle laugh beside me. The empty space next to me reminded me that grief never truly disappears. It simply changes shape and settles into the corners of your life. I had buried my husband 5 years earlier after 46 years of marriage. In those early months after his passing, the church became my anchor. People brought casseroles to my doorstep and checked on me after Sunday service. Ashley, only 21 at the time, used to insist on driving me home because she worried I looked tired. She would sit at my kitchen table drinking sweet tea while telling me stories about college classes and future dreams. "Grandma, when I have children someday, they are going to adore you," she once said with complete sincerity. I believed her. Looking back, I cannot pinpoint exactly when things began to change. There was no dramatic argument, no obvious betrayal. It happened in small moments that seemed harmless at first. Family dinners where Ashley spent more time scrolling through her phone than speaking to me. Birthday celebrations where photographs were taken while someone casually forgot to call me over. Holidays where plans changed at the last minute, and I found myself eating leftovers alone while assuring everyone it was perfectly fine. Heather always had an explanation ready. Ashley was stressed from work. Young people had different priorities. I should not take things personally. Daniel echoed those same reassurances. "Mom, do not overthink it," he would say. "Ashley loves you. Everybody is just busy." I wanted to believe him because mothers spend a lifetime translating disappointment into understanding. We excuse forgotten anniversaries because our children are overwhelmed. We forgive missed phone calls because careers demand attention. We convince ourselves that being needed less is a natural part of aging rather than a warning sign that we are slowly being pushed toward the edges of our own families. I lowered my eyes toward the church bulletin resting in my lap. Ashley's name appeared beneath the morning announcements in elegant print. She was being recognized for her leadership, compassion, and commitment to serving others. Around me, people smiled with anticipation. They admired her confidence, her polished appearance, and the ease with which she spoke about kindness. I wondered if kindness counted only when there was an audience. I wondered whether love still existed when nobody was watching. Across the sanctuary, I could see the back of Daniel's head. He had not turned around once. Heather leaned toward another woman, whispering something that made them both smile politely. Ashley sat straight with perfect posture, prepared for her special moment beneath the approving gaze of the congregation. I should have felt proud. Instead, I found myself studying the distance between the front pew and the last row, realizing that it measured far more than a few yards of polished hardwood floor. It measured years of excuses, overlooked hurts, and the quiet sacrifices older women make to preserve peace long after peace has stopped protecting them. After the final hymn ended and the congregation began filing into the fellowship hall for coffee and pastries, I remained seated for a few moments longer, allowing the familiar rhythm of Sunday morning to settle around me. Children darted between rows of pews while parents reminded them to use their indoor voices. Elderly couples gathered their coats and exchanged updates about grandchildren and medical appointments. Life moved forward exactly as it always had, indifferent to the private hurts people carried beneath their carefully chosen church clothes. Eventually, I rose from my seat and made my way toward the fellowship hall. The scent of freshly brewed coffee greeted me before I reached the doorway. Volunteers arranged trays of glazed donuts and sliced pound cake, while conversations swelled into a comfortable hum. For decades, this had been my favorite part of Sunday mornings. It was where friendships deepened and burdens were quietly shared over paper cups and folding tables. I spotted several familiar faces who greeted me warmly. Mrs. Patterson squeezed my hand and asked how my roses were blooming this spring. Mr. Collins joked that I still made the best pecan pie in Williamson County. Their kindness steadied me in ways they probably never realized. Across the room, Ashley stood surrounded by members of the youth committee. She smiled easily as people congratulated her upcoming recognition. Heather hovered nearby, beaming with maternal pride, while Daniel balanced a styrofoam cup of coffee in one hand. I watched them from a distance, not with bitterness, but with curiosity. I wondered if they understood how visible silence could be. I approached the refreshment table and reached for a napkin when I heard Ashley laugh softly behind me. "Honestly," she said, her voice lowered but not enough to escape notice, "some people just do not understand that not everything is about them." One of the younger women tilted her head. "Who?" Ashley sighed dramatically. "Older relatives who insist on being involved in everything. They make every event awkward and somehow turn celebrations into obligations." A few uncomfortable chuckles followed. You know how it is, Ashley continued. There comes a point where people should step back gracefully instead of expecting the spotlight forever. I stood perfectly still, my fingers resting against the edge of the table. She never said my name. She did not have to. The young women exchanged uncertain glances before nodding politely. One quickly changed the subject to an upcoming fundraiser. Ashley accepted another compliment with practiced ease. The conversation drifted elsewhere, but the words lingered. I glanced toward Daniel. He had heard enough to understand exactly what had been said. Our eyes met briefly across the fellowship hall. For one suspended moment, I saw conflict flicker across his face. Then he looked away and pretended to study the announcements posted on the bulletin board. Heather adjusted the pearl necklace around her throat and moved beside Ashley, placing an affectionate hand on her daughter's shoulder. You cannot please everyone, she said lightly. The important thing is focusing on the future. The future. It was remarkable how often people used that word when they wanted permission to discard the people who had built their past. I carried my untouched cup of coffee to a small table near the windows overlooking the church courtyard. Outside, dogwood trees swayed gently beneath a clear Tennessee sky. I thought about all the times I had defended my family to friends who hinted that I deserved better. I remembered insisting Ashley was simply under pressure. That Daniel loved me even if he struggled to show it. That Heather meant well despite her sharp edges. But sitting there alone with sunlight warming the back of my hands, another possibility settled quietly into my thoughts. Perhaps love was not measured by intentions people claim to have. Perhaps it was measured by the choices they made when kindness cost them nothing at all. And for the first time in a very long while, I stopped searching for excuses on behalf of people who had never once apologized for making me feel small. By the time I drove home that afternoon, the Tennessee sun had climbed high enough to cast long shadows across my front porch. I carried my Bible inside, set my handbag on the kitchen counter, and stood in the silence of the house Robert and I had shared for more than 4 decades. The old grandfather clock in the hallway marked each passing second with steady determination. I slipped off my shoes, poured myself a glass of iced tea, and lowered myself into the same chair by the dining room window where Robert used to read the Sunday newspaper. Outside, the rose bushes he planted 20 years ago were beginning to bloom. I stared at them and realized that painful truths rarely arrive all at once. They reveal themselves slowly, one memory at a time, until eventually the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. I remembered Tommy's 8th birthday party 3 years earlier. Ashley had assured me the celebration would begin at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I baked chocolate cupcakes from scratch and wrapped his gift in bright blue paper covered with tiny baseballs. When I arrived at the neighborhood park, folding chairs were already being stacked and parents were gathering leftovers. Daniel looked genuinely confused when he saw me. "Mom, the party started at noon," he had said. Before I could respond, Ashley stepped forward with a sympathetic smile and claimed there had been a misunderstanding. I apologized for arriving late, even though I had written the time she gave me on the family calendar hanging beside my refrigerator. Then there was Thanksgiving the following year. Heather called 2 days before dinner and explained that the gathering would be small because Daniel had been overwhelmed at work. She suggested we celebrate together another weekend instead. I heated frozen turkey slices in my microwave and watched old holiday movies while rain tapped softly against my windows. 3 days later, photographs appeared on social media. There they were gathered around a beautifully decorated table surrounded by cousins, neighbors, and friends. Ashley captioned the post with the words, "So grateful for family traditions." I pressed the heart icon beneath the picture anyway. Last spring, Ashley organized a Mother's Day brunch at a charming cafe downtown. She posted photographs of smiling mothers and daughters holding bouquets of tulips beneath strings of patio lights. I only discovered the event had taken place when Mrs. Patterson from church mentioned how lovely it had been. Ashley had looked surprised when I asked about it later. "I thought Dad told you," she said casually. Daniel insisted he had assumed I knew. Once again, I accepted explanations that required me to doubt my own memory rather than question their intentions. Sitting in my dining room that Sunday afternoon, I began seeing each incident not as an isolated disappointment, but as pieces of a larger picture. There had always been a reason, always an excuse, always a gentle reminder that I should not be so sensitive. I had spent years shrinking my own hurt to preserve everyone else's comfort. I convinced myself that. Forgiveness meant pretending wounds had never happened. I mistook silence for grace and endurance for wisdom. The truth was harder to accept. Exclusion does not always arrive wearing cruelty openly. Sometimes it arrives disguised as forgetfulness. Sometimes it hides behind busy schedules and awkward smiles. Sometimes it teaches you to question your own worth until you become grateful for crumbs of attention from the very people who should have cherished your presence. I glanced toward the framed photograph resting on the sideboard. Robert stood beside me beneath the church Christmas tree, his arm wrapped around my shoulders, both of us laughing at something beyond the camera's view. He used to tell me that love was revealed through consistency. People show you who they are by what they repeatedly choose, he would say. As evenings settled over the house and golden light faded across the hardwood floors, I finally allowed myself to consider a possibility I had resisted for years. Maybe I had not been accidentally forgotten. Maybe I had been carefully moved farther and farther away until everyone expected me to disappear quietly without ever asking why. Tuesday morning arrived with steady rain tapping against my kitchen windows and the smell of cinnamon oatmeal rising from the stovetop. I had always believed ordinary routines could steady an unsettled heart. I watered the African violets on the windowsill, folded a basket of laundry, and sorted through the stack of mail that had accumulated beside the fruit bowl. The house remained quiet except for the grandfather clock in the hallway and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. I was placing a utility bill into the drawer by the telephone when my landline rang. Very few people called the house phone anymore. Most preferred text messages and social media updates. I almost let it go to voicemail before wiping my hands on a dish towel and picking up the receiver. "Margaret," a familiar voice said warmly. "This is James Miller. Do you have a few minutes?" Pastor James had led First Community Church for nearly 25 years. He had baptized my grandchildren, presided over Robert's memorial service, and visited me during difficult seasons without ever making those visits feel like obligations. "Of course," I replied. "Is everything all right?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "I was hoping you might come by the church this afternoon," he said gently. "There are a few things I would like to discuss with you privately." I agreed without asking further questions. By 1 o'clock, the rain had softened into a light drizzle. I drove the familiar route to the church, passing the small bakery Robert loved and the public library where I had volunteered after retirement. Pastor James greeted me outside his office with the same kind smile he had worn for decades. His office smelled faintly of coffee and old books. Shelves lined the walls, filled with theology texts, family photographs, and framed letters from missionaries supported by our congregation. He motioned for me to sit in the armchair opposite his desk. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Pastor James folded his hands and looked directly at me. "I owe you honesty," he said quietly. "I have been praying about this conversation since Sunday." My stomach tightened, although I kept my expression calm. "What is it?" I asked. He lowered his eyes briefly before meeting mine again. "I heard what Ashley said to you before the service. I saw you move to the back pew." Heat crept into my cheeks. Even at 72 years old, there was something humbling about having your private pain witnessed by someone else. "I appreciate your concern," I replied carefully. "Families go through difficult periods." Pastor James nodded slowly. "That is true," he said. "But grace and silence are not always the same thing." He opened the top drawer of his desk and removed a large manila envelope secured with a brass clasp. He rested it on the polished wood between us. The sight of my husband's familiar handwriting across the front stole the breath from my lungs. Robert Whitaker. Even after 5 years, seeing his name written in blue ink had the power to unravel me. Before Robert passed away, Pastor James explained softly. He met with me several times regarding a memorial initiative he hoped would benefit this church and the community for many years to come. My fingertips brushed the edge of the envelope. "He never mentioned this," I whispered. Pastor James offered a sad smile. "He intended to tell you himself when the time felt right. After his diagnosis, circumstances changed. He left detailed instructions. Margaret, there is something you need to understand. Robert trusted your judgment completely." I stared at the envelope resting before me, my reflection faintly visible on the glossy surface of the desk. Outside the office window, raindrops slid down the glass in silver trails. For the first time since that Sunday morning, I sensed that perhaps the story unfolding around me was larger than the humiliations I had quietly endured. Robert had seen farther ahead than I realized. And somewhere inside the envelope, bearing the steady handwriting of the man who had loved me faithfully for 46 years, there waited a truth capable of changing everything I thought I understood about the people sitting in the front pew. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the brass clasp and unfolded the first sheet of paper from the envelope. Robert had always possessed careful handwriting, each letter neat and deliberate, as though he understood that words mattered enough to be treated with respect. For a moment, I forgot about Pastor James sitting across from me. I forgot about the rain outside and the ache that had settled inside my chest since Sunday morning. All I saw was my husband's familiar script staring back at me from the page. "My dearest Margaret," it began. Tears gathered in my eyes before I had even reached the second sentence. Robert had known his time was limited during those final months. While I had focused on medications, appointments, and finding reasons to laugh despite fear, he had quietly been putting certain things in order. He wrote about our life together, about Sunday mornings spent side by side in the same pew, and about the gratitude he felt for the community we had helped build. Then the tone of the letter shifted. "If you are reading this," he wrote, "it means there may come a time when you doubt your place among the people you love. I hope that day never arrives, but if it does, I want you to remember something you have spent your entire life forgetting. Being kind does not require becoming invisible." I pressed my fingertips against the page and closed my eyes briefly. Pastor James remained silent, allowing me the dignity of absorbing Robert's words without interruption. I continued reading. Robert explained that several years before his diagnosis, he had established a memorial outreach fund intended to support ministries serving vulnerable members of the community. The fund had grown substantially through investments and charitable contributions. It was designed not as a monument bearing our names, but as a practical extension of the values we had shared throughout our marriage. What startled me was not the existence of the fund itself. It was the responsibility attached to it. Robert had designated me as the sole decision-maker regarding its future direction. No committee could override my judgment. No family member possessed authority over its distribution. He had trusted me completely. "Margaret," the letter continued, "people often confuse gentleness with weakness. They mistake patience for permission. They assume that because you forgive, you fail to notice. I know better. I have watched you sacrifice comfort for family, dignity for harmony, and your own needs for the happiness of others. But I hope you never allow anyone to convince you that your presence is a burden simply because it reminds them of obligations they would rather forget." My throat tightened. Memories surfaced one after another. Robert insisting that I buy the dress I loved instead of settling for the cheaper option. Robert leaving notes in my lunch bag when I volunteered at church events. Robert refusing to allow our children to speak carelessly during difficult teenage years because respect mattered inside our home. He had seen me more clearly than I had seen myself. "There is one final condition," Pastor James said softly, drawing my attention back to the office. He opened a folder containing official documents. Robert requested that the fund be guided by a simple principle. It should support those who demonstrate compassion, humility, and honor toward others, especially the elderly and those easily overlooked. The words settled heavily between us. Suddenly, Ashley's polished speeches about service echoed differently in my memory. Heather's dismissive reassurances sounded hollow. Daniel's silence no longer resembled confusion. I thought about the front pew and the back pew, about family photographs taken without me, about celebrations I had discovered only after they ended. They had not wanted my wisdom. They had not wanted my company. They had wanted the version of me that quietly applauded from a distance without requiring acknowledgement. I folded Robert's letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. The rain had stopped outside, leaving sunlight to filter through the office windows. For the first time since that painful Sunday morning, I felt something other than sorrow. It was not anger. It was clarity. And clarity, I was beginning to understand, could be far more powerful than resentment. The days leading up to the following Sunday unfolded with an unfamiliar stillness inside me. I watered my roses, paid my bills, and folded towels fresh from the dryer while Robert's letter remained tucked inside the top drawer of my bedside table. Every morning, I reread portions of it over coffee as sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor. The words never changed, yet each reading seemed to uncover another layer of truth I had been unwilling to face. Being kind does not require becoming invisible. For years, I had mistaken silence for virtue. Now I understood that dignity required honesty, especially honesty with oneself. By Thursday afternoon, Pastor James called to confirm the details of the upcoming service. Ashley's formal recognition by the congregation would proceed as planned. Before the closing prayer, he intended to introduce the memorial outreach initiative Robert had established years earlier. He asked whether I would feel comfortable sharing a few words about Robert's vision. I stared out the window above my sink as I considered the question. The maple tree in my front yard had begun shedding early summer leaves into the grass below. Yes, I answered quietly. I think it is time. Friday evening, Daniel called unexpectedly. His voice carried the careful brightness people use when avoiding uncomfortable subjects. He spoke about work, the weather, and an upcoming charity luncheon Ashley had been helping organize. Eventually, he mentioned Sunday's service. Ashley is nervous, he said with a soft chuckle. You know how much this recognition means to her. I waited. Part of me wondered if he would apologize for what had happened the previous week. Perhaps he would acknowledge the hurt he had witnessed and chosen to ignore. Instead, his voice lowered slightly. I hope everyone can just focus on celebrating Ashley, he added. There has been enough tension lately. I closed my eyes for a moment. Of course, I replied. People should be celebrated for who they truly are. There was a pause on the line before Daniel laughed uncertainly and changed the subject. Saturday afternoon, I opened my closet and studied the familiar row of dresses hanging neatly inside. My fingers settled on a pale lavender dress Robert had loved because, according to him, it made my eyes look brighter. I had not worn it since Easter 2 years earlier. After pressing the fabric carefully and polishing my modest pearl earrings, I placed everything neatly across the bed. There was no desire for revenge stirring inside me. No dramatic speech rehearsed in secret. What I carried instead was something quieter. I wanted to honor the man who had trusted me with his final wishes. I wanted to stand without apology in the space I occupied. Sunday morning arrived clear and warm. As I drove toward First Community Church, I noticed children riding bicycles along sidewalks and neighbors retrieving newspapers from their front porches. The church parking lot was already filling when I arrived. Through the windshield, I could see Ashley greeting members near the entrance. She looked polished and confident in a cream-colored dress, accepting compliments with graceful smiles. Heather stood proudly nearby, adjusting floral arrangements in the lobby. Daniel moved between conversations, shaking hands and thanking people for attending. I parked my car beneath the shade of an old oak tree and sat quietly for a moment before stepping outside. The familiar church bells echoed softly through the air. I reached into my handbag and touched the folded copy of Robert's letter resting inside. Around me, people exchanged greetings and laughter drifted across the parking lot. No one knew the full story carried beneath ordinary appearances. No one knew that a simple acknowledgement planned for that morning would become a mirror reflecting truths some people had spent years avoiding. I closed my car door gently behind me and walked toward the church entrance with steady steps, understanding at last that showing up did not require permission from those who had forgotten my worth. The sanctuary filled quickly that morning, every pew occupied by familiar faces dressed in their Sunday best. The choir's opening hymn rose toward the high ceilings while sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, scattering patches of blue and crimson across polished wooden floors. I walked through the center aisle with my head held high and chose a seat without waiting for anyone's permission. A few people greeted me warmly. Mrs. Patterson squeezed my shoulder as she passed. Mr. Collins tipped his head respectfully in my direction. Across the sanctuary, Ashley moved gracefully among the congregation, accepting smiles and whispered congratulations. Heather adjusted the collar of her daughter's dress with careful hands while Daniel stood nearby, pride softening his expression. From a distance, they looked like the picture of a devoted family. Pastor James stepped behind the pulpit and welcomed everyone with his usual warmth. The service unfolded according to familiar rhythms. Scripture readings, prayer requests, hymns sung by generations of voices woven together beneath one roof. When the time came to recognize Ashley's leadership in the youth outreach ministry, Pastor James invited her forward. Applause filled the sanctuary as she approached the front of the church with poised confidence. She thanked volunteers, mentors, and members of the congregation for their support. She spoke eloquently about service, compassion, and creating a welcoming community where Everyone felt valued. Several people dabbed at their eyes as she described the importance of seeing the dignity in every individual. Her words were beautiful. I could not deny that. The congregation responded with enthusiastic applause. Then Pastor James returned to the microphone. "Before we conclude today's service," he said, "there is another matter close to the heart of this church that I would like to share with you." He paused, glancing toward me. Many of you remember Robert Whitaker and his lifelong commitment to serving others quietly and faithfully. Before his passing, Robert established a memorial outreach initiative intended to support vulnerable members of our community. Today, I have asked Margaret Whitaker to say a few words regarding his vision. The sanctuary grew still. I felt dozens of eyes shift toward me as I rose from my seat. My lavender dress brushed softly against the pew as I stepped into the aisle. Ashley's smile flickered for the briefest moment before settling once again into practiced composure. Heather straightened in her seat. Daniel's brows knitted together in confusion. I carried Robert's folded letter inside my handbag as I made my way to the front of the sanctuary. Standing beside Pastor James, I looked out across the congregation that had witnessed nearly every chapter of my life. I recognized faces from wedding receptions, funeral dinners, Christmas pageants, and potluck suppers. People who had celebrated my joys and mourned my losses. My hands remained steady as I unfolded the carefully preserved letter. Robert believed that kindness was measured not by public recognition, but by private choices. I began softly. The sanctuary remained silent. He often said that our character reveals itself most clearly in the way we treat those who can offer us nothing in return. I lifted my eyes briefly toward the congregation before continuing. He wanted this initiative to support people who have been overlooked, forgotten, or made to feel invisible. He believed compassion required consistency, humility, honor, especially toward those who grow older and become easier to dismiss. A hush settled over the room, unlike anything I had experienced before. I noticed Ashley lower her gaze toward her clasped hands. Heather's posture stiffened. Daniel stared at me with an expression I could not fully decipher. I returned my attention to Robert's words, allowing his voice to guide mine. A family, a church, and a community reveal their values through the seats they reserve for those who came before them. We should never place people in the background simply because their presence reminds us of responsibility, sacrifice, or gratitude. The silence deepened. It was not hostile. It was reflective. For the first time in years, I spoke without shrinking my truth to preserve someone else's comfort. And in that sacred stillness, the distance between the front pew and the back pew no longer belonged to me. When I finished reading Robert's words, I folded the letter carefully and held it against my chest for a moment before looking out across the sanctuary once more. No one moved. The usual rustling of church bulletins had stopped. Even the children sitting beside their parents seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Pastor James stood quietly beside me, allowing the silence to settle naturally over the congregation. It was the kind of silence that invited reflection rather than discomfort. I took a slow breath before speaking again. Robert believed that generosity should never be used to elevate appearances, I said softly. He believed it should restore dignity where dignity had been diminished. I glanced toward Pastor James, who gave me a small nod of encouragement. After much prayer and consideration, I have decided that the Robert Whitaker Memorial Outreach Fund will be dedicated to supporting elderly members of our community who are facing loneliness, hardship, and isolation. The fund will provide practical assistance, companionship initiatives, transportation support, and resources for older adults who too often feel forgotten. Murmurs spread gently through the congregation, not in opposition but in surprise. I continued. Many older people carry invisible burdens. They are present for everyone else's milestones while quietly mourning the absence of invitations to their own. They are expected to give grace endlessly while receiving very little consideration in return. Robert saw that. I see it now too. I lowered my gaze briefly before adding, this decision reflects both his values and mine. When I stepped away from the microphone, the sanctuary remained still for one suspended heartbeat before applause slowly began to rise. It was not thunderous or celebratory in the way Ashley's recognition had been moments earlier. Instead, it felt thoughtful, respectful. Several people stood. Mrs. Patterson wiped tears from her eyes. Mr. Collins pressed his hand over his heart. Pastor James placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. I returned to my seat with quiet composure, aware of the eyes following me as I walked back down the aisle. This time, I did not notice whether the pew was in the front or the back. I simply noticed that I belonged wherever I chose to sit. After the service concluded, people gathered in small groups throughout the sanctuary. Some approached me to share stories about aging parents and widowed neighbors. Others thanked me for giving voice to experiences they had never known how to articulate. Through it all, I remained calm. Ashley eventually made her way toward me. Her expression had lost some of its polished certainty. "Grandma," she began hesitantly. "I did not know." Her voice faltered. For the first time in a very long while, she looked young rather than accomplished. Heather stood a few feet behind her, unusually quiet. Daniel stepped forward next. His eyes were red around the edges. "Mom," he said softly, "I should have spoken up. I should have noticed." I studied my son's face and saw regret there, genuine and painful. I thought about the years spent minimizing my own hurt to preserve relationships that mattered deeply to me. I thought about Robert's unwavering faith in my judgment. Most of all, I thought about the woman I had been before grief and disappointment convinced me to take up less space in my own life. "You did notice," I replied gently. "You just chose comfort over courage." Daniel lowered his eyes. Ashley began to cry quietly, apologizing through trembling words. I listened without interrupting. Then I reached out and squeezed her hand. "I forgive you," I said. But forgiveness does not erase truth. It asks us to do better once we know better. Outside, the afternoon sun bathed the church steps in warm golden light. As I walked toward my car, Robert's letter resting safely inside my handbag, I realized that healing was not about reclaiming a seat in the front row of someone else's priorities. It was about refusing to disappear simply because others had grown accustomed to overlooking you. I had spent years believing love meant enduring every slight without complaint. Now I understood that love also meant honoring the worth God had placed within me from the very beginning. I opened my car door and paused long enough to glance back at the church that had witnessed my greatest joys and deepest sorrows. Then I smiled softly to myself. They had not taken my dignity by asking me to move. I had merely forgotten, for a little while, that no one else had the authority to decide where I belonged.